In a world grappling with the monumental challenge of climate change, the scale of its impact is incomprehensible and will affect billions of people in the coming decades. One of the most crucial aspects of this is climate forced migration. Over the next 30 years, as many as 143 million people will be forced to move their entire lives and abandon places they have called home for generations. Considering the UN Office for Managing Refugees is already staffed with 10,000 employees to deal with current refugee numbers that are far lower than the estimated values for the coming crisis, it is shocking to consider the issue could get worse. Climate-induced migration extends beyond environmental concerns and touches upon human rights, legal frameworks, and million stark realities. According to recent trends, climate-related disasters are displacing more people than human conflicts. In 2017 alone, 60% of the 30.6 million people displaced across the world were directly impacted by climate-related issues. A reflection on how governments currently handle the issue of climate refugees will help frame the progression or lack of it towards climate migration solutions. This section introduces us to the topic of how current legislative institutions deal with climate refugees. When referring to international climate migrants, we talk in terms of refugees because it is currently the only universally and legally protected category of persons fleeing from one state to another on the condition that their sending states are or will be uninhabitable. One argument is to label climate migrants as refugees, not just displaced people without clear regulations. Supporters point to similarities with other refugees, like political refugees facing homelessness, statelessness, or persecution. This suggests climate migrants deserve refugee status simply because they face the same challenges. This tackles the disagreement about why people are suffering due to climate issues. Some say it's about how climate change directly causes people to move, like when a hurricane hits. Others argue that gradual changes, like rising sea levels, should be sufficient to qualify people as refugees. Current definitions of refugees often need a clear and immediate threat. Figuring out whether climate change threats are real is complicated. For example, it's tough to know exactly when land might sink underwater. Broader social and political issues also make it hard to decide whether people need to move right away, creating challenges in determining the legal status of climate migrants. Although scholars have come to understand the complex nature of climate migration, they have not emphasized enough the subjectivity of the migrants themselves. The perspective of causality seems to objectify the migrants, and it is very state-centric. Many African indigenous communities are facing severe effects of climate change, but their voices have often been ignored in discussions led by Western scientists. This overlook is a crucial injustice in addressing climate issues. Western perspectives tend to dismiss other knowledge frameworks as unscientific, leading to potential problems, especially in areas like climate change. These communities have unique views on weather, like believing crows bring rain or predicting rainfall based on the moon's phases. They represent a different kind of knowledge. Justice is hard to achieve for these people, and their understanding of nature may differ from what aid programs assume. Respecting their cultures and ways of life might be a better approach than deciding their fate. Often, the most influential pieces and discussions of climate change focus on the massive predictions about population movement. However, one of the most essential pieces of the issue is where the most impacted communities will go. In 2022, over one-fifth, 21% of displacements resulting from disasters took place in the least developed countries and small developing island states. Despite comprising less than 15% of the global population, these regions experience a significant proportion of displacements. As the climate crisis continues, these numbers will continue to shift in disproportionate directions. The U.S. will certainly be affected, but it is not a comparatively high risk. Furthermore, it is projected that the most forced climate migration will be in sub-Saharan Africa and the Asia-Pacific region. These areas are characterized by high population densities and are particularly susceptible to the impacts of climate change. However, these models only look at populations at risk soon. The UNHCR, which created the model, frames the refugees as in need of international protection or to be of concern as early as November 2023, when the model came out. It does not try to predict the outcomes as far away as 2050. The UNHCR's models estimate that around 30 million people in sub-Saharan Africa are at the highest risk. Most of these countries, like Sudan, Somalia, and Yemen, are some of the poorest in the world. In contrast, the U.S. is looking at only about 1.6 million people that are less vulnerable. The next question is where displaced people will go. As climate-based displacement worsens, issues will compound, and migrants will face new challenges. We already have concrete examples of how migrants face other challenges when relocating, like being forced to move again. For example, many Central Americans have relocated to Belize in the past few decades, often escaping political instability. They reside in informal settlements that become isolated during floods and when dirt roads are washed away. In locations like Jordan, Syrian refugees have added pressure to an already limited water supply. Refugees can often pose challenge to the native populations, which can create tension. The future of the crisis then becomes, what do nations do when they are facing both a climate and refugee crisis simultaneously? While to some, climate migration is a distant future, for many people it's happening to their homes right now. We are going to hear from Abby Warren, who grew up on a small island nation that is currently under direct threat of disappearing due to climate change. She will help to paint a picture of how people actually struggle with this issue every day.
My name is Abby Warren, and I'm from the Marshall Islands.
And where are
The Marshall Islands are halfway between Hawaii and Australia. Growing up in the islands involved a lot of being outdoors. We would go surfing, scuba diving, paddleboarding. There were like 2 World War II shipwrecks like right in front of my house. And we like rode bikes everywhere on the island that I lived on. So definitely outside a lot. Climate change is impacting the Marshall Islands in a couple of different ways. There have been rising sea levels in recent years. Sometimes the water levels rise so much to where it enters people's homes. There's been dying fish, dying coral, due to numerous different things, including the nuclear testing that happened there in like the 50s and 60s. Yeah. I think what's most upsetting about climate change in the Marshall Islands is the fact that it could be going underwater in the next couple of decades, meaning that people would have to leave their homes. People, like the culture of the Marshall Islands would then be dispersed over like numerous different countries, anywhere from like other countries in the Pacific to like the US. And so that culture like could be lost. I think it would be really upsetting for climate migration to happen to the Marshall Islands because it would mean that this country and this culture and group of people would have to spread all over these different countries where their culture would probably be lost because it's already such a small population of people and already a country that so many people don't even know about in the first place. For it to like completely go underwater would mean it would just kind of disintegrate it like in history. A couple of the efforts that I know about that are aiming to mitigate climate change is there was an expedition done by a couple artists on like a sailing trip throughout the Marshall Islands to kind of spread awareness and then see the effects of climate change there. And then there have also been efforts like the Children versus Climate Change program, where one of my friends who was the year below me in school, he is like the prince of the Marshall Islands, and he worked with like Greta Thunberg and some other like youth activists at this convention to raise awareness about climate change. And one of the things that I like love that he said was, we may not have statistics, but we do have eyes. So like part of the problem with mitigating like climate change in the Marshall Islands is we just don't have the statistics or research to like figure out these things, and so nobody's really worried about climate change because nobody wants to fund something that they don't have the statistics for, the research behind. But when you're living there and you see it every day, like you can tell that the effects are happening, that like climate change is real and it's happening to that country. And so I think I feel hopeful about the ways that people have been raising awareness towards climate change in the Marshall Islands, and how it's like the people who are on the front lines are people like in the Marshall Islands and in these specific countries that are like right at sea level or just above sea level. And there's this one activist named Kathy Jednal Kitchener who has been raising awareness about climate change through like poetry and different activism things. And she's really been a voice for people in the Marshall Islands. And so looking to her and people like her and people like my friend Latokne really makes me hopeful, because there are people who are actively fighting so hard to combat climate change and to keep this country alive and this like culture alive there. But when I look at like bigger organizations or what other countries are doing to help, it makes me a little bit less hopeful. So I think raising awareness about it and doing the things that they're doing and then getting other countries who have resources like on board would make me a lot more hopeful. I think the advice I would give to anyone trying to mitigate climate change is to just like be aware of what's happening in places that you are unfamiliar with, because growing up like in North Carolina or like somewhere in the mainland US, you might not see the same effects that you would living in the Marshall Islands, where like the ocean is your backyard and the water's like coming into your house, or like you go out snorkeling and scuba diving and see the reef getting wider and wider and like dying every day. And so I think just like being aware and opening yourself up to other people's experiences, to hear from them, and then care about it and like be called to action to do something, not just be worried about it and think about it and be sad about it, but then like be called to action and do something about it.
Nations have recently proposed solutions to climate migration. People are not doomed to have nowhere to go when the time comes. The first and most important thing would be to resolve climate change. However, the time for that has unfortunately passed. Instead, we must mitigate the damage. There are precedents for this, like climate refugee visas. A program like this was created in New Zealand for Pacific Islanders in 2017. Additionally, individual treaties between nations allow for the passage of refugees from one country to another, like the recent one between Australia and Tuvalu. However, these programs are small, accounting for mere hundreds. Right now, there is no strong solution. This will be an unprecedented climate crisis, and we cannot expect there to be existing policy to deal with it. Despite this, there are some basic principles future lawmakers should account for and respect. First and most importantly, a firm basis for protection against deportation must be established to ensure that immigrants have a right to remain in their new homes. Also, free movement protocols may be important. Free movement calls for people permanently displaced by disasters to be allowed to move freely across borders and stay indefinitely. Climate change is the only threat in history to challenge the entire human population, and so no amount of migration or movement will allow us to escape. We cannot ignore this threat. With massive cross-jurisdictional collaboration, we have a chance at protecting both people and the environment. We have to ask ourselves what we can do to help solve the problem, even if our governments are not acting quickly enough. First and foremost, get educated. There are a wide range of easily accessible resources that describe climate change and its effects, including forced migration. Some great examples are National Geographic's Environmental Refugee website, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees page on climate change and disaster displacement, and climaterefugee.org. Each of these pages contains a wide variety of educational resources and information on the subject of climate change's connection to migration. Write your congressional representatives, asking them to pass legislation to assist in climate change mitigation efforts, or educating them on the topic of climate refugees. Finally, you can donate to organizations like climaterefugees.org, which is led by women of color and works with displaced people all over the world. Get involved, do your part, and remember climate change is an inescapable problem.